Hey, it's 11 a.m. Sydney time, and I'm sure there's, apart from Cindy, who's joined us from Maui in Hawaii, I'm sure there's others from other places than Sydney as well. But so I'd like to get started. And my name's Keith Ayers from Integro, and I really appreciate you joining us for this webinar today. Impactful leadership. What does that mean? And I think that my take on that is that impactful leaders create meaningful change. They make things better than they were before. They take people somewhere where they haven't been before. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today, is how can we use the Everything DiSC Work of Leaders profile to help leaders be more impactful in that way. Okay, so just before we dive into the agenda, just a reminder for you that we have two places where you can type in stuff. There's the chat box if you want to just chat, say hello, or let us know something. And then there's the Q&A box, which is obviously for any questions you've got. And if you could put your questions in there as they come up during the session, and we'll be dealing with those in the wrap-up phase later in the morning. Okay. All right. So our agenda is we're going to start off by talking a little bit about leadership, and then the three stages or steps in the process that leaders use to create impactful change. All right. And that's vision, alignment, execution. That's the foundation of the profile. And then, of course, we'll go to questions at the end. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to just ask you to think about why you're here. Some of you may be here because you want to be a better leader. And some of you may be here because you're responsible for leadership development, either in your own organization or working with clients and their leadership development. And so we'll be covering off both of those key reasons why people might be here. It might also be just simply to find out more. But on the subject of leadership, when I first did this webinar a year or so ago, we did a Google search to find out if you did a search on leadership development, how many results came up, and it was 406 million about a year ago, just over a year ago. All right. And if we did a search on leadership, it was 137 million. All right. Well, in getting ready for this session today, I asked Louise, our marketing officer, to update these numbers and do a current search. And it's just amazing. 822 million on leadership development and 2.7 billion almost searches on leadership just in the last 15 months or so. It's quite amazing, isn't it, that we go from 137 million to nearly 2.7 billion. And maybe that's got something to do with the pandemic, obviously. Another piece of information I'd like to share with you, and this is from research that Wiley have done in asking their clients out there in the work world, what are the most important training topics? And coming in at number one was general leadership development or coaching. Now, I think coaching is part of leadership anyway. Most effective leaders would be effective at coaching their team members as well. And then managing change comes in at number two. I wonder why. But things like boosting employee morale, improving communication, increasing employee engagement, improving culture, leading through a crisis. There's a lot of other topics in there that relate to leadership. So I think it's fair to say that leadership is far and away the most sought after topic in today's world. Okay, so Wiley started off doing some research. Oh, it must be 10 years ago now. And they spent 5 to 6 years studying leadership in order to develop a leadership profile, basically, and a leadership model. And what they were looking for was fresh thinking and insights that represented major breakthroughs, not just the same old leadership development material. So they studied a number of resources from well-known writers like Warren Bennis and Seth Godin. So that's classic versus contemporary, Godin being more contemporary. And then academic writers like Peter Senge, consultants like Patrick Lencioni and the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. All right, and then more the philosophical, John Maxwell, and Kouzes and Posner, authors of the Leadership Challenge, which is more research-based. They have a 360-degree assessment called the Leadership Practices Inventory, and they've collected millions of surveys on leaders, and so they've got a huge amount of data behind the work that they do. So how do we make sense out of all of that? All right, is the key. Well, I want to start off with sharing with you an idea that came up from Carlson Learning Company, who are now Wiley. Back in the early 90s, they commissioned a consultant to do some research on what leadership is, and to start with a blank piece of paper and go out and interview thousands of people to say, what does leadership mean to you? And what her name was Miriam Cragnis, and what she came up with was that leadership is an act. All right. So what is an act of leadership? Well, it's an out, in, out process. Let me explain that. All right. So someone who performs an act of leadership sees something out there that they feel could be better. Now, so this is a leader who's looking at their team and saying, I think this team is capable of so much more, and looking for what that could possibly be. And then they go in and they process in their mind what they see needs changing, fixing, or improving for that team to be what it's capable of, or what she thinks it's capable of. All right. And then the third step in the process is the second out, where she comes out with some kind of action or implementation that results in success, and things get changed, fixed, or improved for the better. All right. So that's impactful leadership, isn't it? Where you look at something and say, wow, I think we could do this, or I think we could do that. And we've all had those ideas, haven't we? All right. And then, but do we act on them? And that's where the act of leadership comes in. Now, I'm going to just give you an example, because anyone can perform an act of leadership. And this is a bit dated, this example, but it's one of the best ones I've come up with. Maybe someone can share with me some more modern one. But just imagine that you got a company that collects forms from its customers, and then someone in the organization, the data entry operator, has to key that information into a program. All right. And the person who designed the form didn't talk to the people who designed the program. Right. And so the information on the form is entered into the program in a different order than what is on the form. All right. And as would happen, the data entry operator in a situation like that, they'd probably complain to each other and say, wouldn't you think they'd redesign this form? But this person decides to redesign the form, and she takes it to a supervisor, and the supervisor says, what a great idea. And they implement it. Right. And that person in a frontline role has performed an act of leadership. She saw something that needed changing, fixing, or improving, thought about it, came up with a solution, put it forward, and it was accepted, and change happened. Okay, so anyone can do that, can't they? And I'm sure people at the front line of every organization see things that could be better, but do they speak up about it? Do they have the opportunity to speak up? So that's an act of leadership, and that fits very nicely with this work of leaders profile. Okay, so one of the things that Wiley found was that DiSC had a significant impact on how leaders behaved, because DiSC is measuring aspects of personality. All right, and all leaders are different. They have different strengths, they have different challenges, they have different blind spots. And so the work of leaders profile, it's a profile like the other everything DiSC profiles, and there's also a supplement for facilitators. All right. Now, when you open the work of leaders profile, pages 2, 3, 4, and 5 are pretty much the same. It's the same information that's in the workplace profile, in the management profile, except it's worded differently because it's you as a leader. All right. So page 4 is a narrative report. Your dot tells the story, and page 5, which we're going to see here, is your shading and priorities. Okay. Now you'll notice that the priorities are different here, the different words, because the priorities for leaders are different. Now, one of the things that's important to understand is that when Wiley was developing this profile, they were looking at it from the perspective of a leader dealing with a group of people, not individuals, all right? So if you want to be more effective as a leader in managing individuals, then you actually would go to the management profile, all right? The leadership profile is one on many, it's one on a group. It could be a team leader with their team, or it could be the CEO of an organization with the whole organization. Look at the leadership they're providing the whole organization, okay? And so that's why the priorities are different around the outside here, okay? That's my DiSC map. I'm an SI style. I have an additional priority on pioneering. I also have an additional priority on action in the workplace profile. So that's consistent. And probably partly because, and here's my supplement report, there's my umbrella graph, okay? So you can see I've got a spike on the DI-ID scale there. So although my dot is in the SI area, because I'm strongest on ISSI and S, and that's the biggest part of my umbrella down there, I do have that additional spike up there. And of course, I have my unexpected items that relate to behaviors I use from the opposite side of the DiSC map, okay? And I'm sharing this with you because I'm going to be sharing my results from the back end of the profile as well, and it will help to remember this spike on the DIID scale as to why I've scored the way I have in some of the other scales in the back, okay? And of course, the other part of the supplement is the priority subscale graph, and you can see there why I have the extra priority on pioneering, because I scored right up to 100% on pioneering, as well as on affirming and inclusive, okay? So they're the 8 leadership priorities, and in the Everything DiSC Work of Leaders Facilitator Kit, there are little videos with each of these leaders explaining how they lead using that priority. So there's some really good little videos, and there's also some good videos in relation to what we need to do to stretch ourselves to be more effective as a leader. Okay, so the model behind this profile is vision, alignment, execution. Now, so 6 years of research, and what Wiley found was that the most successful leaders in organizations were those who crafted a vision, built alignment around that vision, and executed a plan to achieve the vision. In other words, they achieved their vision. They created change. They made things better. They were impactful leaders because they used this process, all right? And so that's important. We're going to be going through this quite thoroughly. So let's start with the model. Okay, here we go with vision, alignment, execution again. Now, underneath each, you'll see there are 3 words. Like under vision, we've got exploration, boldness, and testing assumption. Those are the things we call the drivers. That's what drives the vision. So first of all, in order to come up with a vision, we've got to do some exploration to identify what's the best possible vision we could come up with. We've got to be bold and go for something that's really going to stretch us. Excuse me. And we're going to need to test assumptions. It's all very well to come up with a bold vision, but if it's too risky, it's going to break the bank, then it's not a good idea. So that's why we test assumptions after coming up with this bold vision. Okay, now for each of the 3 drivers, you'll see there are 2 bullet points underneath each, and they're the best practices. They're the things that the successful leaders do in order to come up with the best possible vision. And then under alignment, we have drivers of clarity, dialogue, and inspiration, and again, 2 best practices for each. And then under execution, we have momentum, structure, and feedback as the 3 drivers. And again, 2 best practices for each. So 18 best practices. Now, when the leader is taking this assessment, they complete the first section, which is the Everything DiSC Adaptive Testing Assessment, which is the same assessment as in every other Everything DiSC profile. All right. And of course, if they've done another DiSC profile beforehand, they can use existing data so they don't have to answer all the DiSC questions again. All right. But then they're going to go on and answer 72 additional questions, right? So there are 4 questions for each of these 18 best practices. And that's independently, separately, the leader is identifying how well do I remain open? How well do I prioritize the big picture? Okay, and we'll see how that shows up in a moment. There's one other resource which we have called a book, The Work of Leaders. authored by 4 senior people at Wiley. Mark Scullard, as you can see on the cover there, is the research director at Wiley. You'll hear me talking about him a lot. Actually just got an email today saying Barry Davis, who's the executive director or executive vice president, has announced his retirement. So he's going to be leaving, but he's been there a long time. And I met him in 2002, so he's been there a while. And of course, I've been here a while. So this is a great resource if you're using the Work of Leaders profile. So let's dive into crafting a vision. Okay. My mouse didn't want to work there for a second. Okay. So first of all, I want to share a couple of examples of vision statements. I'm sure you've seen some vision statements and you've wondered, what's that all about? All right. See, a vision statement should be a statement that creates a vision, right? That is a picture. When you read a vision statement, you should be able to say, so that's where this organization is going. This is where they want to be, and this is what they're going to be doing. Because the statement tells a story about that, what that looks like. Okay. So here's one that I came across, which I read it and I thought, what are they talking about? We are nimbly moving into a complex future, leading our industry as we reach for new heights. Our leaders look for opportunities at every turn, and our managers are blasting the competition. We delight in our customer satisfaction. What do they do? All right. So we can try to get too fancy with vision statements to the extent that, see, if the employees in an organization that has a vision statement look at their vision statement and doesn't mean anything to them, it's a waste of time having it. You'd be better off not having one. All right. So think in terms of picture. All right. And then an example of a great vision, I believe, is Southwest Airlines. Their vision is to become the world's most loved, most flown, and most profitable airline. All right. Now, over a period of 30 years, Southwest Airlines was the most profitable company in America. Not just airline company, the most profitable company in terms of returns to shareholders. Right? Not many people knew that because all the talk was about General Electric and, you know, all the big boys. Now, this is before Apple and Google and stuff too. But this is, if you read that, you know what they do, right? And you know what they aspire to. Okay. So that's a good vision statement. Okay. The importance of vision. All right. As part of the research that Wiley did, they asked organizations, who are your best rated leaders and what percentage of them have a strong vision statement for their group? Now, when we're going to talk about group, we can also talk about team, but this profile about vision alignment execution is not just for the senior executive team. It's for any leader. So it could be a frontline leader and their team coming up with a strong vision. So 87% of the best rated leaders have a strong vision. Okay, 10% of the worst rated have a strong vision. So that sort of tells you something, doesn't it? Okay. So let's look at the back end of the profile. And in the back end of the profile, those additional 72 questions you've answered about the 18 best practices, measuring your leadership skills in terms of those best practices. Okay, so in the vision section, we've got 3 drivers: exploration, boldness, and testing assumptions. And so there's a page for each with the 2 best practices showing where you scored on each of the 2 best practices for each of those drivers. All right. And then I'll just zoom into the first one. All right. And these are my scores. And yes, I've scored really high, and being on the right hand end of the scale is the right place to be. So unlike other DiSC profiles, where in the DiSC section of this profile, there's no good or bad profile, right? But in the best practices, there is a good place to be, the best place to be, which is at the right hand end of the scale. Okay, which means that you are skillful in that best practice, which is a good thing if you want to be an effective leader. Okay, I've also put my DiSC map there because it probably would be no surprise to know that I have a tendency to remain open rather than seek closure in exploring a vision because I'm I'm naturally strong on inclusive leadership in the S quadrant there, and affirming leadership, affirming others, right? But when it comes to prioritizing the big picture, that's probably not something that's naturally strong for my SI style, all right? But then I've got that extra priority on pioneering and that extra spike on the DI scale, which probably has a lot to do with why I scored stronger on prioritizing the big picture, okay? And I don't score high on all of these continua. I can assure you, you'll see some more shortly where I don't. But I want to look at this remaining open, all right? Part of the research Wiley did was to ask leaders, which of the following do you find more difficult? Remaining open to all possibilities or closing off options? Is that more difficult? And of course, 65% said remaining open to all possibilities without closing off options was much more difficult for them, okay? And that's a key thing, that if I am at the, what was the other end of that scale? Seeks closure end of the scale, then I'm not going to be able to identify the best possible vision, okay? And so, okay, so let's then go to boldness. And I'm not going to go through all 18 best practices. We don't have time for that. But I'm going to spend a bit of time on vision because this is really the foundation, all right? And so boldness is important in coming up with a vision, all right? Because we've got to stretch ourselves. We've got to go somewhere where we haven't been before, achieve things that we haven't achieved before, all right? And so we need to be adventurous and take a chance on the possibility of failure. We also need to be willing to speak out, to share our bold vision. Because if I've got a bold vision, but I'm not willing to share it, that is, I hold back, then I'm not going to be successful in getting people to embrace that vision, all right? So both of these don't sit well with my SI style. But again, I think they do fit with that pioneering leadership and the spike on my DIID scale, okay? You'll see some shortly where I'm at the opposite end of the scale. So I'm not just showing you all the good stuff, okay? All right, and so the third part of vision is testing assumptions. So if we're going to take a risk and come up with something really bold, before we implement it or start developing an action plan to execute, we need to double check that there's no big risks that we're taking here, all right? And so that's where the testing assumptions comes in. And just a little exercise here, and I'd like you to use the chat box for this. A bat and ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Could you just type your answers into the chat box, please? We've got one. Okay, so the bat costs $1 more than the ball. And how much does the ball cost? Okay, now they've tested this exercise. This came from Wiley, and they've tested it in many different audiences. And in almost the vast majority of cases, the answer people come up with is 10 cents. All right, that's the answer that sort of leaps out at you, isn't it? Okay, but if the bat is $1 more than the ball, and the ball is 10 cents, then the total cost of the bat and ball would be $1.20. Okay, the actual cost is 5 cents. Right, we have a couple of people that got that. Okay, so the bat is $1 more than the ball is 5 cents, and the cost of the bat and ball therefore would be $1.10. But it's the kind of thing that it's just because of the way it's worded, the wrong answer leaps out at you. It just sort of like seems obvious. So we need to be willing to test assumptions, don't we? Okay, thanks for humoring me with that. So let's go on to testing assumptions. All right. And here we have two best practices: seeking counsel getting input from other people, and exploring implications. Now, I told you I'll come up with one of my best practices where I'm at the wrong end of the scale. Okay, seeking counsel is no problem for me. I'm an affirming leader, I'm an inclusive leader, and it fits with my SI style. Okay, but exploring implications rather than pushing forward. So the DIID side of me wants to just get going, let's get started. But exploring implications requires more deliberate leadership, which is down in the C quadrant there, isn't it? And so that's something that I need to learn to stretch to. And so that's the whole point about understanding this and getting this feedback, is that if I'm at the wrong end of the scale, if I'm not using that best practice to be a better leader, I need to learn to stretch myself up to the other end of the scale. And having this feedback is going to help me do that. Okay. All right. So, another part of the research that Wiley did was, because so many leaders were not very effective at seeking counsel, they asked leaders why do they struggle with seeking counsel. There are two primary reasons. Almost half of them feel that they're expected to make decisions on their own. That might have something to do with company culture as well. But also, almost 40% don't seek counsel because they prefer to trust their own instincts. In other words, they're lacking in flexibility. They're lacking in the ability to put their own needs aside and listen to what other people have got to say. All right. And if you're interested in learning about how to measure flexibility, in the Trust Inside assessment section of our website, you'll find the flexibility and trust survey. But we're not going to go into that today. Okay, so crafting a vision. I said earlier that it's not just for senior executive teams. Any team leader can use questions like this to identify a vision for their team, right? What is the team doing? What's it look like? Size, etc. What do you provide? What's the output from your team to other parts of the organization? What are people in the organization saying about your team? Who are your customers? What are they saying about you? And how do people feel about working for your team? And all of that helps create a picture of what I see the team as being capable of being, and identifying a time in the future when I want to be that, and then implementing a plan to achieve that. Okay, so vision is not just for the executive team. All right, so building alignment. In alignment, we had three drivers: clarity, so communicating the vision with clarity, creating dialogue and discussion around the vision to get buy-in for it, and using inspiration to motivate people to get on board with the vision. All right. Interesting study that Wiley did as part of this on alignment was they found that most leaders struggled with getting their teams into alignment. And one of the things they found was that they hadn't had much training or guidance. So where do you think the majority of leaders fell on this in terms of none or almost none through to a great deal? Where did leaders say they were in terms of how much guidance or training they had had? Just type that in the chat box for me. None. C, B. B's popular. A, couple of A's, yeah. Okay, the B's and A's are correct in terms of where most people fell. I'll just come back down here so I can advance to the next slide. So we can see that 26% said A, none or almost none, 39% B. All right, that's 65% of respondents had received none to a little bit of guidance in alignment. So any wonder teams struggle with getting into alignment, or leaders struggle with getting their teams into alignment. Okay, so let's look at the drivers here. So we've got two best practices for each of these three drivers. And again, there's a page for each of them in the profile. And again, I'm going to just zoom in. I'm not going to zoom in on all of them here. We did all three drivers in the vision section. But here I want to talk about clarity, communicating with clarity. And one of the key things is when you're presenting a vision to a team, one of the questions in their mind is why? Why are we changing? Why are we doing this? What's the rationale for this? All right. Now that's something that I don't naturally tend to do. I'm more offering intuition and more inspiration in my communication. And I'm excited about it, and I want you to get excited about it. All right. So this was a big wake-up call for me. And also the structured messaging. My messaging is more impromptu. I don't sit down and plan how I'm going to structure a message to explain things and what the steps are going to be and stuff like that. Okay. And one of the things I found was really helpful for me was to identify who else on my team do I have who's really good at this. So then rather than announce to the team, we're going to, I want to do this, I can sit down with one person and say, hey, what questions would you come up with if I put this to you? All right. And they're going to come up with questions I would never have thought of. Okay. So I need to stretch myself to be more effective at explaining the rationale and creating structured messaging rather than impromptu messaging. Okay. So that's alignment. Okay. And of course, the same thing would apply in looking at dialogue and inspiration and the best practices there. I want to go into execution here. And so once we've got alignment, the team is in alignment with the vision and they're inspired by it and they understand it clearly, right? And we've had two-way dialogue about it and we've discussed it, and now they're on board with the vision. It's like, okay, now how do we achieve it? All right. And so we're going to have three drivers here as well. And one of them is we've got to maintain momentum while we're implementing or executing the plan. All right. And we've got to have some structure. So we've got to have a plan and we've got to provide feedback as we're working on the plan. All right. So again, there's a page for each of the three drivers with 2 best practices for each. And I'm going to zoom in on feedback because I think it's really interesting. Okay. We have the first one is address problems. Okay. So if you're leading a team that's executing a plan and problems are arising, you need to address them and solve them so that the momentum can continue to move forward. All right. You also need to be offering more praise, even partial praise along the way. It's not waiting till they've succeeded before we offer praise. Okay. Now, as you can see, I'm really good at offering more praise. Okay. And that would make sense. The affirming leader would be naturally the strongest leadership style for offering more praise. Okay. Because the word affirming means that. Okay. But addressing problems is the strength of the resolute leader, the DiSC, CD style leader. Okay. It's just opposite where I am. Now, what's interesting about this is to be effective at providing feedback as a leader when we're executing our plan is I've got to use completely opposite skills. Right? One from the Ayers scale and one from the DiSC scale. Okay. So that means that everybody's going to have to stretch to be effective in this area to some extent. Okay. All right. So using the VAE model, again, just a reminder, 3 drivers for each, 2 best practices for each. And these best practices came about because we answered 4 questions about each of those. So 72 questions, additional questions. It takes a while for someone to complete the work of leaders profile. But the feedback is very valuable, obviously, in identifying strengths and challenges. So to be a better leader, and this moves us into the last section of the profile, by identifying the top 3 leadership strengths, the best practices they scored highest in, and the leadership challenges, the 3 best practices they scored lowest in. Okay, so here on page 20, we have all 3 strengths on the one page. In my case, they're all right up the end of the scale. Okay, so I've even got one from executing, initiating. I've got one from boldness and one from exploration and one from momentum in execution. The first 2 are from vision, of course. And we can read through that information and tick cross question mark if we like. Probably going to be ticking all of that because they're my strengths, aren't they? And that's going to feel good. But also this feeds into the action planning as well in terms of how can you continue to use these strengths or use them more effectively, all right? Or are there times when you're not using them? Okay. And then the challenges, And for each challenge, we have a full page rather than having all 3 on 1 page, because this is where the action planning kicks in. All right. And so how do we do that? If we look at more detail there, you'll see that in addition to the continua up there, in my case, I tend to offer intuition rather than explain the rationale. Here are some tips for improvement, right? And then there are 2 case in point examples, all right, of people who needed to develop this best practice, and what the situation was and how they realized that they needed to do this, and what they did to do that. So, and then what are the benefits of improving this area, and how do I go about doing it? And of course, there's the action planning section at the bottom of the page there, all right? Now, there's one other resource that I think is very worthwhile being aware of when you do the work of leaders profile, and particularly if you do it with a group of people, and especially if it's a management team. Now, you can see this report I've produced, the Work of Leaders Facilitator report, is on the Integro management team, and we did this in June 2020. And obviously, June last year, we were, what, 3 months into the pandemic. So we all took the Work of Leaders profile, some of us for the second time, but we wanted everybody to take a fresh one to look at where we were at that point in time, and where are we at as a management team, and what kind of leadership do we need to provide Integro as we go through this very unusual situation. All right. Now, what I wanted to share with you about this profile is that actually shows where each member of the team sits on each of the 18 best practices. Okay. And this one is on planning. This is in execution under structure. And one of the best practices is to plan, which makes sense. Okay. And as you can see, I'm not real good at that. I'd much rather improvise. That's where my natural instincts go, is to improvise. And actually 4 of us are more towards improvising than planning. Okay. And lucky we got Kelly, isn't it? And I think that what's great about this is it makes us as a team more aware of the fact that we need to put more effort into planning. All right. The other benefit of a tool like this is for someone who's in Kelly's position on this particular continua, and in others it's the reverse, but you know, Kelly can see that she has something to offer the team here. And she also needs to be willing to speak up if she feels we're rushing onto things too quickly or whatever, that she has the benefit of this information to say, hang on, I think we need to spend a bit more time on this. Okay, so it's a really great tool for teams, management teams particularly, to help them provide leadership to their organization, to their department, to their branch, whatever. Okay, so okay, so just a reminder, the Work of Leaders profile also has a book, the Work of Leaders. Now, this book is actually quite easy and interesting to read. It's not heavy chapters, it's just full of examples of organizations who've implemented vision alignment execution with success, but also it's full of examples of organizations that haven't done that. And the reason they didn't succeed was because they didn't implement the work of a leader. And the work of a leader, of course, is to come up with a vision, get alignment for the vision, execute a plan to achieve the vision. That's how you have impact. Okay, so key points I'd like to sum up with. Leaders who perform the work of a leader deliver improved results. Right? If you come up with a vision, that's going to make things better, and you get alignment for that vision and you execute a plan and you achieve that vision, you make things better, right? So we have improved results, all right? Performing the work of a leader requires a high degree of adaptability and a wide range of skills. We've got to stretch ourselves, all right? But it identifies where we need to do that. It identifies where our strengths are and where our challenges are and what we need to work on in order to be able to be more effective at that. And just as an aside on stretching yourself, If you haven't had a look at the Everything DiSC Agile EQ profile, that would be a great companion product to use here in terms of teaching leaders how to stretch themselves, to use different mindsets. Okay, and so leadership development is a process, not an event. Okay, I think that for leaders to be ready to actually implement this, and well, you can just use it as part of a leadership development program, of course, and identify challenges and work on developing some action plans to achieve those. But to actually use it to help leaders create a vision, get alignment for the vision, and execute a plan to achieve it, they need to be willing to put in the work to stretch themselves. And so I would suspect some coaching would be very helpful to help them through that process as well, with a coach that is familiar with this model and what they're working on in terms of their best practices. Okay, so I'm going to just go to questions now. I'll zip up into the Q&A, and we've got no questions, no, with nothing in the chat box. Anyone want to put their hand up? Oops. So we planned for a 45-minute webinar, including question time. So we've still got 4 minutes if you would like to ask a question. Oh, interesting question, Karen. Which of the 3 areas do you usually find the lowest score? I think it varies. I think I'd say probably alignment is one area where leaders struggle with. And if you look at the best practices there of communicating with clarity and creating dialogue, getting input, that two-way dialogue, and being open to changing your mind kind of thing, I think that's an area that they would struggle with. Yeah, but it does affect, it's affected by someone's DiSC style as well, as you can imagine, right? Someone who's stronger in the DI area of DiSC would probably need some support with execution, right? And particularly the planning and the follow through on that. And then other leaders would struggle with the vision part. But I think alignment's the area that is, and that's why you saw the results from the survey that Wiley did on that. The question here, is there a particular level of leadership this one can be used on? And the answer is any level of leadership. And it's actually emphasizes that in the profile itself, that you can use this with all levels of leadership. All right. Now, depends on the size of the organization as to what freedom leaders have to come up with a vision, for example. If they're working in a large organization, because typically what happens is a team leader or a department head or business unit leader or whatever, they're given the targets or the goals that they need to achieve, right? They may have some input into it, but ultimately the organization decides what they're going to achieve. And usually those goals are in terms of numbers, not a vision, right? And so if you're presented with a goal, a target that you need to achieve this number for the year, you can still turn that into a vision. And say, okay, what would it look like if we were achieving that? How would our team be operating? How would people be behaving? How would we be collaborating with each other? All right. What would be the culture in the team? What would be the energy in the team if we were achieving that? And what do we need to have in order to be able to achieve that? So it is possible to go from a goal that's been established for you to coming up with your own vision. Okay. And next question is, how does DiSC management play out against work of leaders? DiSC management profile is one-on-one skills. Work of leaders is one-on-many, right? So work of leaders is in working with my group, my team, my organization, whatever the size is, what's our vision? How do we come up with a vision that's meaningful, and then how do we get alignment for that vision? So you're working with a group of people. You're not working with individuals and looking at their DiSC styles. In management, you're working with individuals. It's one-on-one skills, directing and delegating, motivating and developing others, right? And how do I do that with the D style versus the C style? Okay, and looking at the one-on-one conversations that the manager is having with those people, not looking at their team as a group. Okay, so it's very specific. Management, one-on-one, work of leaders, one-on-many. Any other questions? Good question. What are the two best practices for inspiration? I'm not in my office because I'm working from home at the moment, so I don't have the profile in front of me here, but let me just back up a bit. I think I'm not sure how quickly I can get to that. Inspiration. Oh, that's action planning. Inspiration was under, let me do it this way. Alignment. Okay, there we go. All right, so if I just move my chat box out of the road so I can read that. Okay, so the first best practice is being expressive, and the second is encouraging. Okay, so that makes sense. Okay. You right with that, Karen? Okay. Thanks, Hina. Katie's question, do you need to do everything DiSC as well as leaders? The work of leaders profile includes the everything DiSC assessment. So you can do it just from scratch, and it could be the first DiSC profile that anyone's done, but they will get their DiSC style. They will get the first 5 pages similar, but same in terms of layout and information as the other DiSC profiles. And if you have done another DiSC profile, you can use existing data. Okay. All right. No other questions? Any other chat? Any other comments? Okay. Obviously, if you have any other questions that come up, or you would like further information, or would like a walkthrough on something, by all means, contact our team. 1-800-222-902 is our phone number. It's still being answered, although it's not being answered by someone at home. It's transferred from the office. And of course, support@integro.com.au is our email address for support. You can also go to our website, and we have a chat function there. You can talk to somebody and ask questions and stuff. And we, if you looked at the map of our Integro team, we have 10 people. 8 of us have our dots in the S quadrant. All right, a few of us have SI, a couple of SCs, a couple of straight S's, but in other words, we love giving support. So please call on us anytime you want. Thanks for joining us today. Great to have you here, and hope to see you again soon.